Welcome back to the Cozy Storytime, where the world slows down and forgotten tales find their way home. Before we begin, make sure you're sitting or lying somewhere comfortable. Take a slow breath in and gently let it out. You don't need to do anything here. Just listen. Let the noise of the day drift far away, like mist over a quiet hill. Tonight's story takes us back to Middle-earth, but not to war or rings or great battles. This is a quieter tale, one that no bard ever sang, one that trees might whisper if you sat long enough beneath them. This is Bilbo's second journey, one he never told Frodo about. A story hidden not because it was dangerous, but because it was too gentle, too quiet, too true. It begins, like all Hobbit stories should, in a quiet corner of Bag End. In the dust of an old cabinet, Bilbo finds a map, not drawn in haste but with care, pointing not toward gold, but toward a forgotten place that calls to him softly. Though his bones are older and the fire of adventure no longer burns as it once did, something inside him stirs. Not the thrill of glory, but the longing for stillness, mystery, and one final walk under unfamiliar stars. This time, there are no dwarves or wizards by his side. This time, the journey is his alone. And maybe that's why he never spoke of it after. Because it wasn't a tale for others. It was a whisper meant for him. And now, for you. So tonight, let yourself walk gently beside him. No rush, no danger. Just the soft rhythm of feet on mossy paths, lantern light flickering like memory, and the quiet breath of an old world at peace. This isn't a story to keep you awake. It's a story to fall into, like a dream you half remember. If your eyes grow heavy, that's perfectly fine. The story will keep moving, even if you drift off. And if you stay with us until the end, perhaps you'll carry a piece of it with you, a light that lives softly in the heart, long after the tale is done. The day had been quiet in Hobbiton, the kind of day where the breeze was gentle and the grass shimmered under the late afternoon sun. Birds chirped from the hedgerows and the sound of someone chopping firewood echoed from a distant hill. Bilbo Baggins, now long past his adventurous prime, sat in his favourite armchair near the fireplace in Bag End. His hands trembled slightly as he held a steaming cup of tea, and a woolen shawl rested across his shoulders. Though his days were mostly filled with slow walks, reading poetry, and tending to his garden, something deep within him had never quite settled. Not since the Misty Mountains, not since the dragon, not even since the ring. A restlessness hummed in the background of his old age, like a distant flute playing a tune only he could hear. Earlier that morning, Bilbo had decided it was time to tidy the room. He once called his study, now more of a storage place for memories than a functional workspace. Dust danced lazily in the shafts of sunlight that broke through the round windows. The room was filled with shelves of worn books, scrolls, dried inks, cracked pipes, and even a helmet he had found long ago in Dale. In one corner, hidden beneath an old wool blanket, stood a tall, narrow cabinet with a warped door. Bilbo hadn't opened it in years. The keyhole had gathered a web, and the wood smelled of damp age. He tugged at the stubborn door, and with a creak and a reluctant groan, it swung open, revealing stacks of old maps, yellowed parchment, and bundles of notes tied with frayed string. He carefully began sorting through the contents, muttering under his breath, "Ah, the map of Mirkwood. And what's this? My old scribbles on trolls." Paper after paper was pulled out and placed in a neat pile, each one stirring some memory. Then, almost at the very back, hidden between a faded map of the Grey Mountains and a pressed flower from Rivendell, he found it. A rolled parchment sealed with wax bearing a symbol he didn't recognize. It was not Dwarvish nor entirely Elvish, though there were traces of both in the curves of the letters. The seal cracked as he gently opened it, revealing a delicate map drawn in ink so faint it shimmered only in certain light. There was no title, no dates, only symbols, ancient runes, and one central marking. A starburst enclosed within a circle, nestled in a range of unfamiliar hills. Bilbo's breath caught. He did not recognize the place, yet it felt hauntingly familiar, as though it belonged in a dream he had once forgotten. His fingers traced the lines of the map, and he felt a peculiar tug, not from the paper, but from within himself. It was a strange sensation, like the pull of a memory that never happened, something just beyond the reach of understanding. He sat for a long while, staring at it, heart beating with a strange, slow rhythm. "Where did you come from?" he murmured. The room had gone still, and outside the wind picked up just slightly, rustling the ivy on the walls. There was no inscription to guide him, only the paths on the map and that odd, glowing symbol. It seemed to wait for him, quietly. The old hobbit turned to his desk and lit a lamp, its flame flickering a soft amber. With the map laid out before him, he began comparing it with the maps he already knew. The mountain ridges did not match the Lonely Mountain, nor were they near the Misty Mountains. In fact, this place appeared far to the northwest, a region he had never visited nor read much about. Still, something about the drawings, the style of the ink, the placement of ancient elven symbols, reminded him of stories Elrond once told during a long evening in Rivendell. Elvish legends whispered of a hidden sanctuary, long lost, called Erindor, where starlight was once preserved in crystal before the rise of the shadow. But surely that was myth. Elrond had only half believed it himself. Yet Bilbo found himself folding the map carefully and slipping it into the inside pocket of his waistcoat, as though his hands had made the decision before his mind had caught up. He glanced at the door to the hallway, half expecting Frodo to appear with a question or a concerned look. But Bag End was still, save for the ticking of the old clock and the crackling of the fire. He set his teacup down and stood up slowly, his joints aching a bit more than usual. As he stood, he looked out the round window over the hills of Hobbiton, glowing gold in the setting sun. In his chest stirred that old feeling, the same one he'd felt when Gandalf knocked on his door all those years ago. The quiet tug of something greater, something unknown. He smiled faintly and shook his head. "Old fool," he said to himself. "You're too old for adventures now." But the thought didn't sit right, not because of pride, but because part of him didn't believe it. He was older, yes, slower, certainly, but not yet hollow. There was something left, one last flicker of the Tookish fire in him. That night, he sat at his desk long after supper, writing nothing, just staring at the flame and turning the folded map over in his hands. He didn't know when exactly he decided it, but somewhere between dusk and moonrise, a quiet resolve settled over him. He would not speak of this to Frodo. It would be his own journey, quiet and brief perhaps, but one he felt called to follow. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled silently above, Bilbo climbed into bed with a calm heart and a whisper of excitement. The map rested beneath his pillow, a silent companion. Tomorrow, perhaps, he would send word to someone who might know more. Or perhaps he would simply begin walking, as he had once before, without knowing the end. Either way, something had shifted. An old path had been revealed in the dust, and the first stone had been turned. Though no one else in the Shire would know it, Bilbo Baggins was, once again, on the cusp of an adventure. And this time, it would be one he never spoke of, one for his heart alone. The morning sun filtered softly through the round windows of Bag End, casting golden light on the cluttered table where the mysterious map lay unfurled. Bilbo sat before it once again, his breakfast untouched, his tea long gone cold. Outside, Hobbiton stirred gently with its usual rhythm, milk pails clinking, chickens clucking, and the smell of fresh bread floating lazily through the air. Yet, within Bilbo's heart, the rhythm had shifted. He felt like a page had turned in a book he thought was finished. The map glinted ever so faintly under the sunlight, as if it knew he hadn't imagined its strangeness. With a sigh and a decision half formed, Bilbo rose from his chair and reached for a small drawer beneath the writing desk, one that hadn't been opened since Frodo had first come to live with him. Inside was an old silver bell, tarnished and slightly bent. It had once belonged to Gandalf, who had left it behind years ago after a particularly smoky evening involving fireworks and 3 confused sheep. Bilbo smiled at the memory and gave the bell a gentle ring. The sound it made was clear, almost too clear, and it carried far beyond Bag End's walls, up into the air like a whispered invitation. Bilbo knew it would find its way to Gandalf if the wizard was anywhere near the Western Lands. He hoped he hadn't grown too rusty to answer the call. True to his nature, Gandalf did not arrive immediately. Days passed and Bilbo kept himself busy pruning hedges and pretending not to glance too often at the road. He kept the map hidden beneath his waistcoat during the day and under his pillow at night. He said little to Frodo, only that he was doing a bit of old research, though Frodo seemed suspicious at Bilbo's frequent daydreaming and late-night candle burning. On the 5th day, as Bilbo trimmed the rose bushes, a breeze picked up out of nowhere. It carried the scent of pipeweed and rain. Bilbo straightened, heart fluttering, and then came the familiar sound, the creak of a staff tapping on stone, the rustle of robes, and the unmistakable deep hum of a voice halfway through a tune. Gandalf stepped into view as though he had always been there, tall and grey, with his hat slightly askew and his eyes twinkling beneath brows that seemed even bushier than before. "You rang, my dear Bilbo?" he said with a grin. Bilbo chuckled, unable to hide his relief. "Well, it's not exactly a birthday party, but I hoped you'd come." He ushered the wizard inside with all the courtesy of old times, and within minutes, tea was poured, the fire lit, and the map laid out between them on the table. Gandalf leaned over it with furrowed brows, the end of his beard brushing the edge of the parchment. He studied the map in silence for a long time. Occasionally, he murmured words in languages Bilbo didn't recognize, snippets of Old Elvish perhaps, or something older still. At last, Gandalf leaned back with a soft sigh and filled his pipe. "This is no ordinary map," he said. "You know that, of course. Where did you find it?" Bilbo explained, gesturing toward the old cabinet, but Gandalf seemed unsurprised. Strange things tend to hide in quiet corners when they grow tired of being noticed. He tapped the map gently. "This symbol here," he said, pointing to the starburst, "is ancient, older than Rivendell. It marks a place that has not been walked by any living feet in an age. The elves once called it Erendor, the Star Hollow." Bilbo leaned closer. "So it is real then?" Gandalf nodded slowly. "Real and forgotten. Some say the light of the two trees was once preserved there, long after the trees were gone. But others say the place became a well of sorrow, poisoned by shadows that crept in after the last elf lights dimmed. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between." He paused to puff thoughtfully at his pipe. "But this map, it should not be here. It was believed lost in the fall of Eregion. Whoever placed it in your cabinet did so with care and purpose." Bilbo frowned. "But why me? I'm no great wizard or warrior." Gandalf looked at him kindly. "No, you're not. But sometimes it is the quietest feet that reach the deepest places, and hearts unburdened by pride can carry light further than most." He stood and walked slowly toward the fire. "But if you go, Bilbo, know this. The shadow that lingers in Erendor is not the kind that fights with swords or fang. It is a waiting shadow, the kind that lives in memory and regret. You will not face beasts or armies, but you may face truths even a brave hobbit might flinch from." The room fell into a soft silence, broken only by the crackling fire and the ticking of the old clock. Bilbo stared at the map, tracing its lines once more. He thought of his first journey, of goblins and dragons and golden halls. He thought of the ring, of its weight and whisper, and the cold nights it brought. And yet, something about this felt different. There was no treasure promised, no glory, only a quiet place waiting to be seen. "Then I must go," he said finally, his voice steady. "Not for stories, not for songs, but because it feels unfinished." Gandalf nodded. "I thought you might say that." He reached into his robes and produced a small leather pouch. Inside was a single silver coin, etched with the same starburst symbol. "This may help you find the entrance, if ever you lose your way. But remember, Bilbo, the way is not always through the trees. Sometimes it lies through the heart." Bilbo took the coin, its weight surprisingly warm in his hand. He knew then that his path was set. The door had opened once again, quietly, and he would walk through it. As night fell over Hobbiton, the wizard took his leave with a quiet farewell. Frodo asked no questions that evening, though he eyed the empty chair across the room with concern. Bilbo sat for a long time at the window, watching the stars bloom like silver flowers in the sky. The map lay folded beside him, the coin resting on his palm. He felt the old stirring again, not as a thrill this time, but as a gentle summons. Something distant had called to him, and he had answered. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it not as a hero, but as himself, Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, a hobbit who once went there and back again, and was now ready, quietly, to go once more. The next morning came soft and grey, a light mist hugging the hills as if the land itself whispered of secrets. Bilbo moved about Bag End with quiet purpose, collecting a few necessities with the air of someone preparing for an extended walk rather than a true journey. He packed light, a change of waistcoats, a small pouch of pipeweed, a notebook, some dried apples, and of course the silver coin Gandalf had given him. The map he tucked safely into the folds of his jacket, close to his heart. His old walking stick, leaning in the corner by the door, felt heavier than it used to, but familiar in his hand. He gave it a light tap on the floorboards and nodded to himself. One step, then the next, he said under his breath. He had debated whether to leave Frodo a letter, but in the end chose only a brief note, carefully folded and placed under a paperweight on the kitchen table. Gone to look into a few old matters. Don't fret, I'll be back before first frost. There's seed cake in the pantry. Bilbo. It wasn't much, but enough. He didn't want Frodo to worry, nor did he want the whole Shire to start whispering that old Baggins had lost his mind again and wandered off chasing dragons. This wasn't about dragons or dwarves. It was something quieter, something he still couldn't name. As he stepped out of his round front door, the morning air met him with a soft chill. The road ahead curved gently through the hills, the mist slowly lifting like a veil being drawn back from the world. Bilbo walked without hurry, letting the rhythm of his steps settle into his bones. The grass was damp beneath his feet, and the sky hung low and pale. No one noticed his departure, save for a few birds and one particularly observant fox, who paused mid-step to study him curiously before vanishing into the brush. He took the north path, away from the water, skirting the edge of the green hills where fewer hobbits tended to walk. It was the long way round, but Bilbo preferred it. The trees here were older, the paths narrower, and he felt as though they remembered him. Now and then, he touched the coin in his pocket and felt the warmth of it pulse ever so slightly, like a heartbeat guiding him onward. By midday, he had left the last traces of Hobbiton behind. He paused on a grassy knoll and looked back only once. Bag End was barely a speck, its chimney lost in the folds of the hills. Ahead, the land sloped upward gently into regions even he had never explored, dotted with thickets and stone outcrops shaped like sleeping beasts. Bilbo sat for a while under an ancient birch, sipping from a flask of water and humming a tune half remembered from Rivendell. He did not feel afraid. Tired, yes, his knees ached, and his pack seemed heavier than he remembered packs being. But fear was far from him. If anything, he felt quietly content, as though walking into a long-forgotten dream that had waited patiently for his return. The trail began to fade as evening approached, replaced by worn deer tracks and scattered signs of foxes and badgers. Birds flitted above, their songs growing quieter as shadows lengthened. Bilbo pressed onward, trusting his feet and the map's quiet tug in his heart. He reached a small glade near twilight, where a clear spring bubbled out of a rock and the air smelled of mint and moss. Here, he decided to rest for the night. He unrolled a light blanket, leaned his back against a tree, and lit a small fire with careful hands. The flames danced gently, casting warm light that flickered over the trunks and low branches. The woods around him held a calm silence, not empty, but watchful, as though something was listening kindly without judgment. As he smoked a bit of pipeweed, Bilbo turned the silver coin over in his fingers. The starburst etched into it shimmered faintly, catching the firelight with an odd luster that seemed not entirely of this world. He held it close and whispered, "Where are you leading me?" No answer came, but the coin grew warmer in his palm, and for a moment, Bilbo imagined he heard music, distant, lilting, like elvish singing carried on wind through a stone corridor. He closed his eyes, letting the sound fill him. Memories stirred, the halls of Elrond, the laughter of dwarves, even the dragon's lair with its echoing silence. But this was different, softer, no greed, no fear, just longing and light. He felt something open in his chest, something he hadn't felt in many years, wonder, untouched by fear or burden. That night, sleep came gently, though his dreams were vivid. He walked through a forest of silver trees under starlight, following a path lit by flickering lanterns that floated in the air. A voice called his name, not in alarm, but with affection, and he turned to see a figure robed in light, their face hidden in the glow. They stretched out a hand toward him, and in their palm was a crystal, pulsing with the same starburst as the coin. When he reached for it, the forest dissolved into mist. He woke just before dawn, the fire now ash, but the warmth of the dream lingering like a memory too deep to fade. As he packed up his things, Bilbo noticed something curious. The map had changed. A new path had appeared in faint ink, leading northwest toward a range of hills marked with runes that hadn't been there the day before. He stared at it, mouth slightly open, and touched the coin again. It pulsed once in his fingers, and the new lines shimmered briefly before settling into the paper like they had always been there. He folded the map carefully and tucked it away, heart beating just a little faster. It seemed the map was guiding him now, not just showing the land, but responding to him. The thought was both unsettling and thrilling. He straightened his back, took one last look at the spring, and set out again. The road was no longer a road. It was barely a path, winding through deep brush and patches of tall grass. He passed stones marked with old carvings, none in the common tongue, and once he came upon a tree whose trunk had been burned long ago, yet from it bloomed a single white flower. Bilbo paused and touched its petals, soft as silk. "Still growing, are you?" he said quietly. "So am I, it seems." He continued on, with fewer doubts now. Whatever lay ahead, it was something meant for him, not because he was a hero, but because he was still curious, still willing to follow the song he heard in the quiet spaces of the world. By the third day of his quiet journey, Bilbo found himself in the highlands west of the Shire, a land rarely walked by hobbit feet. The hills rose and dipped in slow, steady waves, like the breathing of some great beast beneath the earth. The grass here was rougher, and sharp stones jutted from the soil like half-buried teeth. Trees stood farther apart, their bark pale and ancient, and the wind carried with it a hum, faint and rhythmic, as though the very air was whispering secrets in a tongue too old to name. Bilbo paused often to listen. It wasn't imagination, he was sure of that. He'd heard wind before. This was something different, like a song half remembered from a childhood dream. It was soft but insistent, always seeming to come from just ahead. Late in the afternoon, he came upon a ridge from which he could see a wide valley ringed with low, crumbling cliffs. At the heart of it stood a large stone structure, overgrown with moss and lichen, nearly sunken into the earth. Time had clearly forgotten this place. It bore no sign of recent travellers, no paths, no broken twigs, no soot from fires. Only the hush of forgotten things and the low, pulsing hush of the wind. Bilbo studied the structure, recognizing nothing familiar in its design. The stones were fitted without mortar, stacked with such care that not even a blade of grass had managed to squeeze between them. At its center, a dark archway opened into shadow, and as Bilbo watched, the air before it shimmered faintly, like heat rising off summer stones. Despite the creeping sense of awe, or perhaps because of it, Bilbo descended into the valley with quiet steps. He moved slowly, stick in hand, heart thumping not in fear, but anticipation. The coin in his pocket had grown noticeably warm as he approached, its steady heat urging him forward. He touched it absently through the fabric of his coat, grateful for its strange reassurance. As he neared the stonework, he noticed that small symbols had been etched into the archway, runes, though not dwarvish. They curled and looped like vines, delicate and glowing faintly, even in the dimming light. Bilbo stood before them, eyes wide. "Elvish?" he whispered. But no, it wasn't quite that. It felt older, less refined, wilder, words that hadn't been spoken aloud in an age. He stepped through the archway, and instantly the wind fell silent. The hush was so complete it rang in his ears. The interior was cool and dry, the air thick with the scent of stone and something older, dust perhaps, but also earth and the faintest trace of flowers long dead. The chamber beyond was round and high-ceilinged, with a single shaft of light spilling down from a narrow opening above. The beam lit the center of the room, where a pedestal stood, weathered and cracked, but still proud. Upon it lay a stone tablet no bigger than a dinner plate, covered in the same curling script as the entrance. Bilbo approached slowly, every step echoing softly. He reached out and touched the tablet. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the coin in his pocket flared with heat. A whisper filled the chamber, not in words, but in feeling, like a memory rushing back all at once. Bilbo gasped softly and staggered back, eyes wide. Images flickered across his mind. A silver tree under starlight, a deep pool reflecting not water, but sky, a voice humming in the dark. It was as if something long asleep had stirred, not angry, but aware. The room itself seemed to breathe, its silence now heavier, watching. Bilbo steadied himself and stepped back to the pedestal, this time more carefully. "I mean no harm," he said aloud, voice small in the vastness. "I'm only looking." To his surprise, the air before him shimmered again, and the script on the tablet began to shift. Letters rearranged themselves, reshaping into words he could read. Not easily, but enough. The light lost shall guide again. Memory returns where a silence stood. Follow the hollow star. The message was brief and cryptic, yet it filled him with a strange calm. This was not a warning, he sensed, but a direction. The hollow star, was that what Erendor meant? A hollow where starlight once was? Or perhaps still was. He pulled out the map and watched as a new mark appeared. A small symbol in the shape of the coin's starburst, now glowing faintly near the eastern edge of the valley. He remained in the chamber until the light from the ceiling faded. Outside, the sun had set, and the world was bathed in the soft blue of twilight. He made camp near the stone structure, not daring to wander in darkness, but sleep came uneasily. That night, his dreams were filled with strange visions. He saw Frodo standing at Bag End's door, looking out with worry. He saw a figure cloaked in twilight standing beneath a shattered arch, holding something bright in both hands. He saw stars, so many stars, falling like tears across a darkened sky. He awoke before dawn, the fire barely smouldering, and sat up with a slow sigh. Whatever this place had shown him, it was only the beginning. By the first light of morning, Bilbo was already moving again, retracing his steps from the chamber to the symbol on the map. The coin no longer burned, but now felt gently alive in his hand. It pulsed in time with his steps, guiding him through the valley's far end, where a cleft in the rock opened just wide enough for a hobbit to pass. He slipped through, brushing against damp moss and stone, and found himself in a narrow passageway that descended at a slant. The air here smelled of earth and roots. Faintly, from somewhere deep within, he thought he heard the sound of water, steady and echoing. He continued for what felt like hours, until the passage finally widened into another chamber. This one natural, carved by time and water. A pool lay in the center, still and perfectly clear, reflecting the ceiling's low stone in perfect symmetry. On the far wall, carved into the rock, was the symbol again, the hollow star, larger than before. Bilbo approached it slowly. Something within the pool began to glow. Light rippled across the surface, and the reflection shimmered, not with the ceiling, but with stars. Real stars, somehow, shining from beneath the water. He knelt and touched the surface. It felt like silk, yet as his fingers grazed it, he felt a wave of sorrow wash over him. Not his own, but old and vast. In that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. This place was not just a remnant of the past. It was alive in a way few would understand. It remembered. It waited. And now that it had been found, it had awakened. Whatever it guarded, whatever lay deeper still, had not yet shown itself. But Bilbo knew he would not turn back. There was a story here that had never been told, not of war or kings, but of forgotten light and memory. He dried his hand on his sleeve, sat quietly for a long moment, and whispered to the water, "I will follow." Bilbo lingered by the starlit pool far longer than he had intended. There was something deeply soothing about the place, despite its solemn hush. The light from beneath the water still shimmered faintly, as though some long-forgotten sky were trapped within, refusing to fade. It cast gentle ripples of light across the cave walls, and in their dance, Bilbo thought he saw fleeting shapes, trees swaying in windless woods, tall towers crumbling beneath moons, long vanished. He didn't know if they were memories of the world or figments from the pool's own ancient dreaming, but they stirred something deep in him nonetheless. A soft ache, like the pang of a song that never quite resolves. The hollow star carved into the far wall had grown dim now, the faint radiance within it barely perceptible unless he stood directly in front of it. When he placed his palm against the stone, it pulsed once, almost like a heartbeat answering his own. There was no door, no passage hidden behind the carving, but he felt with certainty that this was not the end of the path. It was merely a pause. Something was waiting for him to understand. He sat down near the pool, pulling out the map once more. To his surprise, another change had begun to form, slowly, as though appearing through mist. A faint line arched away from the valley, toward what appeared to be a forest marked only by a single word, Cylinder. He whispered the name, tasting it on his tongue. Cylinder. It rang like bells in the distance, soft and lilting. Not elvish, not dwarvish, older perhaps. His fingers brushed over the new mark, and again the coin warmed in his pocket, gently this time, like a sleeping creature stirring from slumber. It was clear now that the map wasn't simply guiding him. It was growing with him, responding to the choices he made and the places he dared to tread. He sighed, then slipping it back into his coat. There would be no clear instructions, no grand declarations. He had to keep walking, keep trusting that each quiet mystery led somewhere just beyond the next hill. Before leaving the chamber, he filled his flask with water from the pool. It looked no different than ordinary spring water, but as it caught the light, it gleamed with an inner sheen. He didn't know if it held magic or memory, but he felt compelled to take it with him all the same. A parting gift, perhaps, from a place that had once known stars. The path upward was more difficult than his descent had been, and his knees ached with each step. But there was resolve in him now, a steady thread of purpose that made the weight of age feel less burdensome. By the time he emerged from the cleft into the open air, the sky was deep with the indigo of evening, and stars had begun to blink into view. The forest marked on the map as Cylinder was not visible yet, but Bilbo sensed its direction. The land rolled onward into a quiet plain, speckled with low shrubs and windswept rocks. He walked through the night, letting the stars guide him, humming softly to keep his spirits up. The song that came to his lips was an old one, half remembered from Rivendell, with no clear beginning or end. It drifted like mist between the verses, its melody lilting and full of space. He sang to the stars, to the trees unseen, and perhaps to himself most of all. The world around him listened and did not answer, but somehow that silence was comfort enough. By dawn, the land had changed again. Trees began to appear, first in scattered clumps, then more densely. They were tall and slender, their bark a deep silvery grey, and their leaves pale green tinged with violet. These were not the trees of the Shire, nor any wood Bilbo had ever known. They gave off a faint scent like lavender and rain, and when the wind moved through them, their branches shimmered as though dusted with frost. The light that filtered through their boughs was soft and filtered, and the path beneath them was carpeted in a thick layer of moss, cool and springy beneath his feet. Bilbo stepped into the forest with a deep breath, the kind one takes before plunging into deep water. The air here felt still but not stagnant, like the pause between heartbeats. It was a silence rich with waiting, as if the trees were not merely alive, but aware. He moved slowly, not wishing to disturb whatever peace lay in this place. A short way into the wood, he found a small stone resting against the trunk of an ancient tree. Upon it sat a lantern, old, iron-bound, with a thick glass belly. It was unlit, but clean, as if someone had placed it there only moments before. Curious, he lifted it. Inside was a wick, coiled neatly around a strange blue gem that shimmered even in shadow. He held the lantern up, studying it closely. As he turned it, the gem sparked faintly, and the flame sprang to life of its own accord. Cool blue, steady, and calm. Bilbo blinked. There was no heat from the lantern, but it filled the air with a gentle hum, and the light it cast revealed tiny markings on the trunks of nearby trees. Runes carved so finely they were invisible in ordinary light. He turned in a slow circle. The runes formed a trail, curling around trunks, slipping from branch to branch like a thread of glowing ink. The lantern's flame pulsed in time with his heartbeat. This, he realized, was the next piece of the puzzle. Not a weapon, not a tool of destruction, but a guide for the hidden path. The name Cylinder returned to him, echoing softly. Was this forest part of some long-lost realm? Had others walked these woods, guided by this very light? He thought of the runes, the pool, the starlight, fragments of a song left behind by those who came before, waiting to be sung once more. Bilbo clutched the lantern close and followed the glowing trail. He did not rush. The forest seemed to honor slowness, rewarding patience with clarity. The further he walked, the brighter the runes became, as if they remembered being seen. And though he met no creature and heard no voice, he did not feel alone. Something walked with him, unseen, perhaps, but kind. After hours of quiet steps, the path brought him to a clearing where a single tree stood, vast and gnarled, its trunk twisted like braided ropes of silver. In its center was a hollow, shaped almost like a doorway. The runes led directly to it, their glow now soft and steady, as though the trail had reached its end. Bilbo stood before it, the lantern flickering calmly in his hand. There was no fear in him now, only that same humbling sense of wonder, like the hush before a tale too old to be remembered properly. He stepped toward the hollow, ready to listen, ready to see. The hollow in the tree was not as narrow as it had seemed from a distance. As Bilbo stepped closer, the opening revealed a short passage that sloped gently downward, the air inside cool and tinged with the faint aroma of sap and ancient earth. The blue flame in the lantern flickered once as he passed through the threshold, then steadied, casting its soft light upon bark that was not bark at all, but something smoother, polished like wood turned to stone. Along the walls, the same glowing runes began to appear, as if reacting to his presence. They coiled and branched like vines, spelling nothing he could read, but filling the space with a quiet reverence. Bilbo took one careful step after another, letting the hush of the place press gently around him like a comforting blanket. The corridor deepened, curving slightly, and he realized he was moving not through tree, but through memory, like walking into the heart of something that had once been alive in a very different way. The air was thick with the scent of forgotten springs and far-off rain. And then, quite suddenly, the passage opened into a chamber, low-ceilinged and round, like the base of a mighty trunk. In the center stood a pedestal carved from the same silver woodstone, and upon it sat a small crystal sphere. The lantern's flame pulsed as if recognizing something ancient and kindred. Bilbo approached slowly, each step measured, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The orb glowed faintly, pale blue with shifting stars dancing inside like a storm caught beneath glass. He stared into it, and slowly, without warning or command, the room dimmed and the crystal's light grew. It rose into the air, floating just above the pedestal, and expanded slightly, shimmering like water stirred by unseen wind. Within the orb, shapes began to form. Not shadows, but scenes, places. A tower standing above a darkened lake. A woman cloaked in leaves, singing beside a tree older than mountains. A silver ship gliding silently over water that reflected no stars. Bilbo watched in quiet awe, his breath slowing. These were no visions from his own memory. They belonged to someone or something else. A voice began to speak then, not aloud, but inside his thoughts. It was not harsh or commanding, but deep and distant, like the echo of a story told to a child in sleep. You have walked where silence holds sway. You carry the coin of remembrance and the light that seeks paths lost. Few return to places once forgotten. Fewer still understand what they awaken. Yet here you are, Second Walker, bearer of the hollow star. The voice paused, and Bilbo's heart quickened slightly at the title, Second Walker. What did it mean? Was there a first? What is this place? He asked softly, unsure if the voice would hear him. The orb shimmered, and the voice returned, slower now, like pages being turned in an ancient tome. This is Cylindar, the Lanternwood, once a haven of keepers who remembered the world when it sang in silver and shadow. Time passed, the song faded. The keepers slept. Bilbo's throat tightened. The sadness in the voice was not grief, but acceptance, the kind that comes after centuries of silence. He stepped closer to the orb. "Why show this to me?" he whispered. "I'm no elf, nor wizard, just a hobbit with a walking stick and an old map." The orb pulsed gently, and the vision inside shifted again. This time, it showed Bilbo himself. Older, yes, and perhaps slower, but standing beneath starlight with the coin raised high. "Because even the smallest voice can awaken an echo," the voice answered. "And sometimes the echoes are what call the stars home." Bilbo didn't fully understand, but something in his chest swelled quietly, as if a key had turned in a lock long closed. The vision faded slowly, and the orb settled back onto the pedestal. The room brightened once more, though the light remained soft and dreamlike. Bilbo sat down cross-legged on the smooth floor, the lantern beside him. He felt not tired, but deeply full, his heart and thoughts brimming with stories not his own. There was comfort in knowing this was not a place of danger or power in the way most adventurers sought, but something older and quieter. A place of memory, preserved not to be used, but simply to be remembered. He thought of Frodo then, of the boy's wide eyes and curious mind. A part of him longed to tell this tale, yet he also knew, deep down, that some stories are not meant to be shared, not because they are secrets, but because they are sacred. Eventually, he stood again. The orb's glow had dimmed, and the runes along the walls had faded into stillness. The lantern flame steadied once more, pointing gently toward the corridor behind him. It was time to leave, not because the journey was over, but because it was changing shape. The forest would not hold him any longer than it needed to. Bilbo bowed low toward the pedestal, not out of fear, but respect. "Thank you," he said softly, "for remembering." The walk back up through the passage felt lighter, as if the tree itself had grown hollow to make way for him. When he stepped again into the light-dappled woods of Cylindar, the hush had shifted. Not gone, but warmer, like a sigh let go at last. He followed the path out of the clearing, and though the runes no longer glowed, he needed no guide. The forest let him go with quiet grace, its trees parting slowly around him. At the edge of the wood, where the silver trunks gave way to the world's rougher green, he looked back only once. The hollow tree stood still, unmoved, yet he could feel its memory watching him, not judging, but knowing. The coin in his pocket was warm again. The map, when unrolled, had shifted once more. A final mark had appeared, farther south than any he'd yet travelled, near the edge of a lake not labelled before. Above it, a simple name, Airluin. The journey, it seemed, had one more chapter waiting. Bilbo rolled the map carefully, tightened his pack, and stepped forward once more into the wild. The journey to the lake marked a Luin on the map took Bilbo several days. The land sloped gently downward, the air growing cooler with each step, as though the earth itself were exhaling slowly after a long, quiet dream. The lantern's flame no longer danced with urgency, but glowed steadily, as if content to simply keep him company. He passed through rolling meadows speckled with blue flowers that opened only at dusk, and over hills where the wind carried a tune he could never quite catch. Though he met no travellers and saw no homes, he never felt truly alone. Something, perhaps the memory of Cylindar, or the lingering presence of the map's magic walked with him, silent and kind. One morning, after a gentle rain had softened the path beneath his feet, Bilbo crested a ridge and caught his first glimpse of the lake. Aelluin shimmered like a piece of the sky laid carefully upon the earth. Its waters were still, without ripple or wave, yet not stagnant, alive with a calm energy that reached outward like the hush before a song. The lake was surrounded by tall reeds and willows whose branches dipped low into the mirror surface. There were no boats, no docks, and no birds flew overhead, yet it felt inhabited, not by folk perhaps, but by stories too old to wear faces. Bilbo stood in silence for a long time, heart full and breath light. Then he began his descent, step by step, as if approaching something sacred. At the edge of the lake stood a single stone, waist high and round, covered in moss so fine it looked like velvet. Bilbo brushed it gently with his sleeve, revealing an engraving, a hollow star just like the one on the coin. The lantern in his hand pulsed softly, and from its base, a tiny thread of light reached down to the symbol, like a final thread being tied. He set the lantern on the stone and waited, uncertain of what to expect. The waters remained still, the wind held its breath, and then, like a whisper from beneath the lake, a voice stirred the air, not with words, but with presence. It was as though the lake itself had begun to listen. The light from the lantern spread outward, casting rings of gentle glow across the lake's surface. Shapes began to emerge, ripples, not of water, but of memory. Bilbo saw scenes again, but fainter this time, and closer to the heart. Himself as a younger hobbit, crouched in Gollum's cave, riddles on his tongue, and fear in his belly. Gandalf on the road, eyes twinkling with secrets. Thorin beneath the lonely mountain, proud and doomed. But these were not painful. They were soft-edged, like dreams remembered after many peaceful years. He smiled gently, not as one who mourns, but as one who honors. And slowly, the shapes shifted. He saw Frodo, eyes wide and burdened, Sam, loyal and sure, and behind them, the long road of stories yet to come. Bum. The lantern dimmed, and the visions faded like mist. Bilbo felt a stillness settle over him, not emptiness, but completeness, a quiet knowing. He reached into his coat and pulled out the coin. Its silver had dulled, and its warmth had cooled. He held it up one final time, then placed it on the stone beside the lantern. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the coin vanished in a single breath of silver light, drawn into the stone as if it had returned home. The lantern's flame flickered once more and gently extinguished itself. All was still. Bilbo sat down on the mossy bank, his pack beside him, his walking stick across his lap, and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, not quite, but rested in a peace deeper than sleep, listening to the soft lap of unseen waves against the shore. When he opened his eyes again, the sun was low, casting gold across the lake. The stone was bare now. The lantern, the coin, gone. Not stolen, not lost. Simply finished. Bilbo stood slowly, feeling no sadness, only a soft gratitude that filled his chest like spring air. He took one last look across the lake, committing every detail to memory, then turned his back to it with quiet reverence. The path home would be long, but it no longer felt like an end. It was simply the next part of the song, a return note in a melody that had carried him farther than he ever dreamed. He hummed softly as he walked, not the song of elves or dwarves, but something simpler, a tune of hobbit feet on old earth, of kettle whistles and garden beds, of letters unwritten but understood. Years later, long after Bilbo had returned to Bag End, Frodo would sometimes catch his uncle gazing quietly out the round window, eyes far away. When asked about what he was thinking, Bilbo would only smile and mutter something about stars and quiet places. He never told anyone about the second adventure, not because it was too grand or too secret, but because it lived better in silence. A story meant to be felt, not told. The coin, the lantern, the lake, they became part of him. A quiet chord that hummed beneath every step, every breath. He wrote no songs about it. He penned no tales. But sometimes, In the hush between pages, if one listened very closely, one might sense a lingering echo. Not loud, not proud, but warm and eternal. And so the tale ends, not with dragons or battles or rings of power, but with light remembered, silence honoured, and a hobbit who walked a path few knew existed. His was not a tale of triumph, but of wonder. A second adventure, as rich and real as the first, kept safe in the quiet folds of his heart. The stars had guided him once more, and in doing so, they had welcomed him home. And so, Bilbo's second adventure fades quietly into the night, just as it was meant to. There were no trumpets sounding his return, no pages written in bold ink, only the soft settling of peace on a hobbit's heart, and the way the stars seemed a little warmer when he looked up at them afterward. This story wasn't one to be told at the Green Dragon or scribbled between lines of old maps. It was the kind of story you carry quietly, like a pebble in your pocket or a song you hum without knowing why. And now, you carry it too. A gentle tale passed softly from his heart to yours, like lantern light drifting over still water. Let it settle. Let it stay. The world outside can wait a little longer. Here, in this hush between dreams, there is nothing to chase, nothing to fix. Just stillness, breathing slowly with you, like the rhythm of soft leaves brushing your window, or the quiet tick of a clock in another room. If your eyes haven't closed yet, let them flutter gently now. You've walked far enough for one night. Let your thoughts drift like boats over Lake Eowyn, quiet and unhurried. Let the story hum in the background, not as words anymore, but as calm, as rest, as something remembered deep in your bones, even if you've never walked there yourself. Sleep comes gently now, like an old friend returning. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself walking again beside Bilbo in your dreams. The path ahead is soft, the air is kind, and the stars are already lighting the way. You don't need to hold on to anything. You're safe. You're warm. You're already home. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle and your heart light as a hobbit's step on the edge of dawn.